Compared to other colors, it's safe to say white has had the least overtly broken or overpowered cards. That's not to say white is without powerful cards. In fact, white has had potent cards throughout the history of the game. However, many of its best cards tend to be more good for being strong answers or complements to other cards rather than mostly stand on their own in a vacuum. As such, while white's most pushed and powerful cards are often less overtly broken, they still have had quite an impact on how the game is played. Starting us off at number 10, we have Rest in Peace. This enchantment costs 1 generic 1 white mana, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile all cards from all graveyards. It also has the effect of, if a card or token will be put into a graveyard from anywhere, it's exiled instead. This card is perhaps the strongest form of graveyard hate in the game, partly since it answers everything. It not only exiles the cards currently in the graveyard, it will prevent any new cards from entering the graveyard at all, as long as it's on the board. Even other strong graveyard hate cards tend to only do one or another. Either exiling cards currently in the graveyard, or through some effect that either prevents cards from entering the graveyard, or in some cases prevents them from leaving the graveyard instead. Rest in Peace's only real weakness compared to other anti-graveyard cards is the fact that it costs colored mana, since there are many strong graveyard hate cards that have no colors in their cost. That aside, Rest in Peace forgoes more narrow or limited forms of graveyard restriction and instead takes the blanket approach. There's very little ways to interact with exiled cards, meaning a deck built around the graveyard losing a large graveyard to Rest in Peace can often be game losing. Even if Rest in Peace is removed right away, its Enter the Battlefield effect will still remove all the cards currently in the graveyard, meaning that even if your opponent has removal, it won't fully protect them. Rest in Peace would perhaps be higher on this list, but the main thing that holds the card back is that it's considerably more narrow than other cards on this list. Rest in Peace most commonly sees play in sideboards of decks as opposed to main boards, given that there's no guarantee your opponent will be playing a deck that's susceptible to graveyard hate. But given just how powerful the card is against graveyard decks, and just how ubiquitous graveyard decks are in multiple formats, Rest in Peace will remain one of the most common white sideboard cards in multiple formats. However, the other cards ahead of it on this list all see considerably more play in the actual main deck. And at number 9, we have Esper Sentinel. This artifact creature is a human soldier that costs 1 white mana and has 1 power and toughness. Whenever your opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, Esper Sentinel allows you to draw a card unless your opponent pays mana equal to its power. Even without any buffs or changes, this means that unless your opponent pays 1 generic mana extra for their first non-creature spell on a turn, you get to draw a card. Similar effects to this have existed for years with cards such as Rhystic Study, yet they exist almost entirely in blue. White in particular does not have access to much repeatable card draw. So even though Esper Sentinel is conditional, it is unique. And every competitive format centers on powerful non-creature spells, so it's rare you'll find a matchup where Esper Sentinel's abilities are relevant. While drawing a card is the ideal outcome for Esper Sentinel's ability, even making a spell cost 1 more mana can be quite potent. Given that competitive Magic is focused on mana efficiency, even making a spell cost 1 more mana can be enough to offset someone's game plans for the turn. Beyond its ability, the fact that it's an artifact creature with a mana value of 1 makes it a solid option for aggressive artifact decks. The card sees the most play in modern Colossus Hammer decks. Not only does giving Esper Sentinel equipment make its card draw even harder to deny by increasing its power, it being an artifact is important for cards in the deck that have abilities that require a certain number of artifacts. The card mainly sees play in aggressive decks, and decks that have access to colors with better card draw such as blue tend to have more general options. While this card is comparatively niche, it's powerful enough that it sees wide play in modern and other formats. The biggest point against Esper Sentinel is that it only taxes the first spell each turn. While it does mean you'll draw a card if they cast a spell on your turn as well as their turn, if they go for a big combo turn with lots of spells, you'll only ever draw a card off the first spell. Despite this, the card has still become one of the premier creatures for white aggressive decks in formats where it's legal. And at number 8, we have Ephemerate. This instant spell costs a single white mana and exiles target creature you control, then returns to the battlefield under its owner's control. It also has the keyword Rebound. This ability makes it so that if you cast the spell from your hand, you exile it as it resolves. Then, in the beginning of your next upkeep, you may cast the card from exile without paying its mana cost. Essentially, you get to use this spell twice, once whenever you'd like, and again on your upkeep. For spells such as Ephemerate, this means you're able to use it both reactively and proactively. Spells that exile a creature then instantly return it are often referred to as flicker spells, and can be used for a variety of reasons. The most straightforward use of this is to reuse an ability that triggers when a creature enters or leaves the battlefield. However, a flicker spell can also be used to protect a creature from removal. If your opponent targets your creature, you can respond with Ephemerate to flicker the targeted creature. When it re-enters the battlefield, it is technically treated as a new creature, and thus the original kill spell does not do anything. One of the most powerful interactions with Ephemerate, however, is how it works with the Invoke elementals. Solitude, an honorable mention that could arguably on this list, is a creature with a powerful effect when it enters the battlefield that can be cast at instant speed for no mana. However, the creature's invocability both gives it a cost of exile on a white card from your hand, but also forces you to sacrifice the creature instantly upon entering the battlefield. If you respond to this sacrifice trigger with Ephemerate, you can flicker the Solitude and get its powerful removal ability again, and keep the creature since it's a new entity that was not cast with Evoke. This interaction works with any flicker spell, but Ephemerate and its rebound ability allows for the most value for the lowest mana value possible. This interaction has become the cornerstone of the Evoke Elementals deck in Modern, and a large part of why the deck is so potent in the format. Given that the card is also uncommon, the card has seen vast success in the Pauper format as well as Modern and some Legacy play as well. Flickering will always be a powerful effect since there will always be good enters and leave the battlefield trigger. While the card is not ubiquitous in Legacy, Death and Taxes decks use it to both protect their valuable creatures and get more value off of their surge effects such as Recruiter of the Guard. Ephemerate is both one of the lowest mana value flicker effects possible and has a stronger effect than some cards with much higher mana costs. From the moment it was printed, it had a massive impact on multiple formats, which it still sees play in to this day. And at number 7, we have Prismatic Ending. Prismatic Ending is a sorcery that costs X generic and 1 white mana. It exiles target non-land permanent if its mana value is less than or equal to the number of colors spent to cast Prismatic Ending. This means that if X is 0 and you only pay a single white mana, Prismatic Ending can exile target non-permanent lands with a mana value of 0 or 1. While this by itself would be too narrow to be considered running, in various formats there are many permanents that Prismatic Ending could answer for just 1 mana. The strength of Prismatic Ending, however, comes in its flexibility. While it can't ever hit a permanent with a mana cost higher than 5, many competitive decks run very little, if any, cards with a mana value higher than that. Generally speaking, Prismatic Ending is rarely ever cast for 5, but that's mainly because many of the key threats to remove are often low on the mana curve. By being so flexible, Prismatic Ending can be relevant at basically any point in the game. If drawn in the early game where you only have access to 1 mana, it can still exile a 1-drop. However, in the late game, if it needs to remove a larger permanent, you're likely to have time to find the necessary mana. This is especially true given how consistently 4 and 5 mana color bases have become in modern formats like Modern Legacy, given the prevalence of powerful color fixing lands. Prismatic Ending decks in those formats have adopted the card primarily because of its flexibility in multiple matchups. Most of the pieces of removal tend to limit you to certain types of permanents. The best creature removal in the game will usually be unable to hit an artifact or an enchantment, and vice versa. Prismatic Ending trades off being narrow on what permanents it can hit, by instead limiting what mana values it can hit at any given time. And while this means the card will sometimes be irrelevant if a deck is focused on bringing out higher mana value permanents, in most matchups Prismatic Ending offers a versatile answer to many of the most relevant threats. And at number 6, we have Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. This legendary creature costs 1 generic and 1 white mana, and has 2 power and 1 toughness. While Thalia is on the board, all non-creature spells cost 1 more generic mana to cast. Thalia also has First Strike, which means in combat it will deal damage before creatures without First Strike. Given that Thalia has 2 power, this means any creature with 2 or less toughness will not only die to Thalia in combat, but they will die before dealing any damage. This makes Thalia a potent creature in the early game, able to attack freely since most low mana value blockers would die without even trading out for the Thalia. This combines with Thalia's other ability to form the backbone of white aggressive decks. These aggressive decks most often struggle against spell-focused decks and decks that run lots of removal and board wipes. Thalia forces these spells to cost 1 more mana, which, as we discussed in the Esper Sentinel's entry, can often be enough to prevent a spell from coming down that turn. Unlike Esper Sentinel, Thalia taxes every non-creature spell, meaning that she'll constantly strain your opponent's resources until she's dealt with. Thalia buys these aggressive decks more time and often forces the first piece of removal to be spent on her instead of one of the deck's other threats. Stalling a board wipe by a single turn or making it so an opponent can't cast 2 removal spells in the same turn are both minor at surface level, but in practice, allow for these aggressive decks to have more room to sneak in damage as quickly as possible. Decks that run Thalia often aim to either end the game as quickly as possible or drag out the game through other taxing effects. Since her printing in the original Innistrad block, there have been various creatures that riff off its effects, such as the aforementioned Esper Sentinel, but Thalia is still far and away one of the most played tax creatures in the game, thanks to her aggressive stats and simple yet effective ability. And at number 5, we have Mother of Runes. This card is a human cleric that costs 1 white mana and has 1 power and toughness. You can tap Mother of Runes to give target creature you control protection from color of your choice until the end of turn. Protection means that creatures cannot be damaged, enchanted, blocked, or targeted by anything it has protection from. Meaning, you can use Mother of Runes to give a creature protection and then allow it to block anything without dying. However, the most common use for Mother of Runes is to use it reactively to dodge removal. Since many white strategies are focused on creatures, those decks are naturally susceptible to being blown out by a kill spell. Mother of Runes' ability makes it so an opponent needs to have 2 pieces of interaction to effectively deal with something, using one to bait out the Mother of Runes activation and the other to actually deal with the card. And even then, most commonly your opponent will be forced to kill Mother Runes first as to not have to spend even more cards in attempting to remove key creatures. By forcing your opponent to often waste multiple pieces of relevant interaction, Mother Runes often stonewalls your opponent from profitably dealing with your threats. And since white often struggles with card advantage compared to other colors, means of equalizing on cards like this help shore up white's weaknesses. Since Mother Runes can target itself, it means that unless answered right away, it will usually trade out for 2 cards at least. Mother Runes is a staple in white decks and Legacy, and not even legal in newer formats like Modern. Powered down retrains of the cards such as Giver of Runes have been printed in the years since and are actively playable in Modern. As such, it's safe to assume that if Mother Runes was ever printed into Modern, it would quickly become one of the most played white creatures in the format. And in the formats where it is legal, Mother of Runes remains one of the most impactful creatures a deck can land, given just how effective it is at protecting your board. Its only major weakness is that thanks to Summoning Sickness, it can't tap the turn it comes out, meaning your opponent has 1 turn to remove it before it can protect permanents. But this window is quite tight, especially if the card is played on the first turn. As such, Mother of Runes has been dominant despite this for well over a decade of competitive play. And at number 4, we have Balance. This sorcery costs 1 generic and 1 white mana, and is notably the only mono-white card banned in Legacy. Its effect checks to see the lowest number of lands any player controls, then forces each player to sacrifice lands until every player has that number of lands. It then does the same for creatures, forcing players to sacrifice until they're all the same lowest number, as well as forcing players to discard down. If one player had 0 cards in hand, 0 creatures, and 2 lands, each player would discard their whole hand, sacrifice all their creatures, then sacrifice all but 2 of their lands. While this effect is symmetrical and can hurt the player who casts it, in practice, a deck that runs Balance actively holds back on playing lands and creatures. Decks could then use Balance as a massive board wipe, forcing their opponent to sacrifice all the creatures they spent the last few turns casting. Similar cards that affect all players like this have been printed since Balance, but generally those cards cost upwards of 4 or 5 mana, if not more. Notably, those cards also tend to bring every player down to a specific number of permanents, such as Tragic Arrogance, giving you 1 permanent of each type. These modern iterations of the effect also tend to not count lands, since mass land destruction is an effect that Magic tends to avoid in modern card design. Balance, despite its name, is remarkably unbalanced. Given how low its mana cost is, one can float all of their mana before casting Balance, then deploy more threats of the leftover mana, whereas your opponent won't be able to rebuild as easily. It doesn't take much effort to get around Balance's surface level symmetrical effect and find a way to devastate your opponent while harming yourself very little. As such, the card is banned in Legacy outright and even restricted in Vintage. However, it doesn't see much play in the Vintage format, partially because of the format's reliance on artifacts for mana, a permanent type which Balance does not check. If Balance were illegal in other formats, it would likely be quite impactful. Modern does have the card Restore Balance, which has a functionally identical effect, but cannot be cast by conventional means. It requires you to either wait for the card, as it sits in exile for 6 turns, thanks to its suspend ability, or it requires you to find a way to cheat it out. And as such, the card requires a bit too much effort to be utilized outside of gimmicky decks. Balance arguably could be higher on this list. However, seeing as how it doesn't even see much play in the one format it's legal in, keeping it here felt fitting. While the card is undeniably pushed and its effect certainly backbreaking, it makes for very slow, grindy games without much inherent payoff to draw players towards it. Especially since in Vintage, it being restricted means you're not going to always draw into it every game anyway. And at number 3, we have Monastery Mentor. This human monk costs 2 generic and 1 white mana and has 2 power and toughness. It also has the keyword Prowess, which gives it a +1 power and toughness until end of turn whenever you cast a non-creature spell. Monastery Mentor has a second effect that triggers whenever you cast a non-creature spell. This one creates a monk creature token with 1 power and toughness as well as the keyword Prowess. Monastery Mentor does not see much play in formats like Pioneer and Modern, despite being legal there. However, the card is restricted in Vintage, a format with a comparatively much more powerful card pool. This is partly because Monastery Mentor is at its most powerful when in chorus with a variety of powerful non-creature spells in Vintage. Between artifacts like Mox Jet and the other fast mana, not only will there be plenty of ways to get at Monastery Mentor early, but also plenty of cheap non-creature spells to cast both in the form of those mana rocks and the spells you pay for with them. Similar creatures like Young Pyromancer have existed even before Monastery Mentor, yet comparatively did not dominate Vintage. This is because specifically both Mentor and the tokens it creates have prowess. A 1 power token will not do much on its own and can't properly get through blockers. However, with Monastery Mentor, it doesn't take many spells at all to suddenly give it, and the tokens, much more reasonable offensive stats. This is compounded by the fact that each spell cast also produces more tokens, meaning even if the attack that turn didn't kill you, there'd be even more tokens on the follow-up. While most token generators produce a stream of fodder to chump block with or sacrifice, the inclusion of Prowess allows these tokens to get big enough that now your opponent is forced to block with and give up their actual creatures to not die to the tokens. Mentor decks were powerful enough that the card was eventually restricted. And even then, the card still makes appearances in decks, especially since Vintage has cards such as Demonic Tutor to help find it. Given the nature of Vintage and how it doesn't ban cards conventionally, it's safe to say Monastery Mentor will remain the strongest white creature in Vintage for quite some time. However, its success is limited to Vintage mostly, which is the only real point against the card. And at number 2, we have Stoneforge Mystic. This core artificer costs 1 generic and 1 white mana and has 1 power and 2 toughness. Whenever it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an equipment card and put it into your hand. You can also pay 1 generic and 1 white mana to tap Stoneforge Mystic and put an equipment card from your hand onto the battlefield. While in general, equipments have never been the most successful creature type, over the years they've amassed a density of playable and powerful options. As such, Stoneforge Mystic's search effect, while narrow, does have a wide breadth of targets for both general uses and for more specific corner case scenarios. This search effect alone would have likely led to Stoneforge Mystic being playable over time. However, what made the card so effective even early on was its second effect. One of the major downsides of equipments is that they require you to both pay mana to cast them, but then also pay mana to equip them to a creature to reap the benefits. This makes most equipment generally quite high mana inefficient and limits their playability. Stoneforge Mystic allows you to avoid the upfront casting cost of an equipment in a way that also dodges counterspells, since you don't actually cast the equipment. In particular, this interacts quite favorably with living weapon equipment that creates 0 power and toughness germ tokens they automatically attach themselves to. In the early years before the card was allowed in Modern, Stoneforge Mystic would threaten to drop a powerful living weapon such as Batterskull and overtake the game from there. Eventually, Stoneforge Mystic was unbanned in Modern after being pre-banned in the format's inception. From there, more cards would come out such as the powerful land Urza's Saga, and even a new powerful living weapon that was a game-ending threat on its own in the form of Cauldron Complete. This density of artifact support has led to an equipment deck now being one of the best decks in Modern at the time of recording this video. These Colossus Hammer decks leverage Stoneforge Mystic to both search up their namesake card, but also the various one-of equipments they run as a small toolbox package. Stoneforge Mystic also sees play in Legacy, where it has access to the powerful Umezawa's Jite that can invalidate most opposing creature decks outright if left unchecked. As more powerful equipment gets printed, Stoneforge Mystic's already high ceiling only has room to go higher. It remains to this day the best equipment support card ever printed, and one of the most powerful white cards by far. And finally, at number 1, we have Swords to Plowshares. This instant costs a single white mana and exiles target creature. That creature's controller gains life equal to its power. Swords to Plowshares is the most simple card on this list. It's an unconditional removal spell that has a minimal drawback. Generally speaking, no amount of life is worth the creature you're going to lose. Most removal with absolutely no drawbacks or conditions tend to cost at minimum 3 mana. And while Swords was designed to have a drawback, its drawback is so negligible in the grand scheme of a game of Magic that it basically doesn't exist. Because of this, Swords to Plowshares is the most effective single mana removal spell in the game. It even specifically exiles the card, meaning that even if your opponent plays around their graveyard, the creature is still gone for good. Path to Exile is the most comparable card to Swords to Plowshares, since they both have the same cost and exile a creature. However, Path to Exile allows your opponent to search their deck for a land and put it into the battlefield tapped, meaning while you're removing their creature, they're advancing their mana. Path to Exile is still an extremely good card and sees heavy play, yet comparatively, Swords to Plowshares is light years better. There are even some decks that actively don't want to gain life. Using Swords to Plowshares on a Death Shadows not only removes a potentially large threat, but Death Shadows actively aims to keep its life total as low as possible, so making them suddenly gain life in the middle of a turn could disrupt their plays. Even if the opponent is fine with gaining life, they'd almost always rather have that creature to pressure life total or further their own game plan. There's not much to say about Swords to Plowshares since it's so powerful and so simple. In terms of competitive formats, it's never been printed in Modern and remains one of the primary reasons why decks play white in Legacy and Vintage. While far less complex than every other card on this list, Swords to Plowshares is a key example of why early Magic card design was so imbalanced. To this day, Swords to Plowshares remains one of the best, if not the best, removal spell ever printed in Magic the Gathering, and by extension, the best card white has ever gotten. And that's it. An honorable mention should go out to White Plume Adventurer. But given that we've talked about the initiative cards frequently on this channel recently, we opted to feature other cards instead. Are there any cards you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, go ahead and leave them down in the comments below.